John Locke was an Englishman from Somerset. Born in 1632, his long life ended in 1704. His father fought for Parliament in the Civil War. Locke himself was at Westminster School, kept in by the royalist headmaster, while King Charles I was executed in Westminster Palace Yard. At Oxford, Locke did well enough to continue as a fellow of his college. In 1667, he moved to Exeter House in London to serve as resident personal physician and one-man brains trust to the future Earl of Shaftesbury, founder of the Whig Party, the first modern electoral party. With the fall and flight of Shaftesbury, Locke, too, had to go into exile. But after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Locke came home, in the same ship with Dutch William's English Queen Mary. Although Locke exercised an ever-growing influence in conversation and through letters and private memoranda, his important publications all belong to the 2 years immediately following the Glorious Revolution. Locke was then already in his late 50s. His classic of general philosophy is an essay concerning human understanding. This is a diffuse work. Locke himself explained that he was too busy to reshape the accumulated materials of many years into something more athletic and succinct. He explains his new project in a deservedly famous statement.
5 or 6 friends, discoursing on a subject very remote from this, found themselves quickly at a stand by the difficulties that rose on every side. After we had a while puzzled ourselves, without coming any nearer a resolution of those doubts which perplexed us, it came into my thoughts that we took a wrong course, and that before we set ourselves on inquiries of that nature, it was necessary to examine our own abilities and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with.
Locke's first step was to maintain that our understanding must be limited by the range of ideas available to us. In one interpretation of this too comprehensive term, an idea is an element of consciousness. These private elements, Descartes had urged, are the only immediate and unshakable certainties. Such ideas form a forever impenetrable veil of appearance, precluding all direct acquaintance with the universe around us.
For methinks the understanding is not much unlike a closet wholly shut from light, with only some little opening left, to let in external visible resemblances, or ideas of things without. Would the pictures coming into such a dark room but stay there, and lie so orderly as to be found upon occasion, it would very much resemble the understanding of a man in reference to all objects of sight and the ideas of them.
This picture of the observer, life imprisoned in his one-man cinema, is, though extraordinarily seductive, disastrous. If, in truth, we never can directly observe the objects of sight, or the objects of any other senses, then how can we know that there really are such objects? Still more alarming, how can any one of us know that there are other people, since each can know others only as a special kind of things? Fortunately, Locke also construed the word idea in another less psychological and less technical way. In this second interpretation, to have the idea of, say, loyalty is not to have any sort of mental picture, but to know the meaning of the word loyalty. Working on this line, Locke, to his own surprise, found that he was becoming more and more concerned with words. The third of the 4 books of the essay is entitled simply Of Words. This book also begins interestingly but disastrously. Locke contends that all language must be logically private, in the sense that its every word has to be definable in terms of the ideas of the person whose language it is, ideas here in the first sense again. Yet, as Locke at once noticed, no such language could share any of its vocabulary with any other. Therefore, it could not serve as a vehicle of communication. This notion of a logically private language was Wittgenstein's prime target in the philosophical investigations, although Wittgenstein himself never gave any sign of having read Locke. With characteristic inconsistency, but good sense, Locke forthwith proceeds to another, more realistic account of language. His investigation into the limits of the understanding ceases to be an exercise in armchair psychology. It becomes an inquiry into fundamental kinds of concept and into the evidence appropriate to establishing different sorts of theses. One most important insight here is that things do not have to and may not fit into any of the slots already provided and labelled. Locke often anticipates phrases from the final chapter of The Origin of Species as he labours to ensure
that we may not be mistaken about genera and species and their essences as if they were things regularly and constantly made by nature and had a real existence in things, when they appear, upon a more wary survey, to be nothing else but an artifice of the understanding.
Locke, like Darwin, would have smiled wryly at the citation of the Swedish Academy in honour of Linnaeus, who discovered the essential nature of insects. Yet the deepest and most salutary influence of Locke's essay came neither from its fascinating disasters nor from insights such as this, but from things which, thanks to Locke, are now to us too obvious to notice. Locke changed the whole intellectual climate because in sober sanity he drew a map of learning in which different inquiries are presented as different. When, in his philosophical letters, Voltaire saluted England as the country of Newton and of Locke, he was in part paying tribute to this transformation. But those same philosophical letters of Voltaire, promptly banned by the French censorship, also recommended the balanced constitution and the religious toleration for which Locke and the Whigs had fought in the thin years, and which Locke's political writings sought to justify. The first of these political writings, a letter concerning toleration, was written during Locke's Dutch exile. Today this letter is often faulted and dismissed on the specious ground that Locke was inconsistent to refuse to extend toleration as of right to Roman Catholics. In fact, the often inconsistent Locke was here perfectly consistent, and his reasons make the letter peculiarly relevant to problems of political toleration in our own time. Locke wanted not only to achieve, but also to maintain the maximum of religious toleration, and he insisted that any right to this must be grounded on a willingness to concede the same rights to others. He always accepted Roman Catholics, or as he preferred to say, papists, on two clearly stated grounds. First, because they gave their prior loyalty to a foreign power. Second, because where they could, they denied religious liberty to others. The relevance of this to the claims of fascists in the 20s and the 30s and of Marxist-Leninists right up until today and tomorrow is obvious. For many of these anti-liberal movements have in fact served as the instruments of foreign powers. Quisling's fascists in Norway, for instance, and the Muscovite communist parties everywhere outside the USSR. Even where this first, less important charge cannot be sustained, it remains always a defining characteristic of both the fascist and the Marxist-Leninist that, power once seized, they never tolerate political opponents. Locke, therefore, would conclude, I think quite rightly, that while we liberals may, for our own reasons, give our enemies scope to destroy a liberal society, such enemies have no moral right to a toleration they would not reciprocate, nor do our liberal principles require that we concede this to them. Locke's two treatises of civil government were published, in the words of his preface, to establish the throne of our great restorer, our present King William, to make good his title in the consent of the people. but drafts were written originally as contributions to the much earlier, more hazardous Whig campaign to exclude the Roman Catholic Duke of York, who was later, as King James II, to fulfill all their worst fears. The first of these two treatises is now only an historical curiosity. It's a polemic against the divine right of kings. The second treatise remains one of the great landmark political documents. Locke here deploys argument against despotism and in favour of a balanced form of government with separated powers. What Locke is against is what was for James II a model and an ally, the contemporary French despotism. What Locke commends is the Glorious Revolution settlement, which was later, with many improvements and in a republican form, to become the Constitution of the United States of America. There are awkward and obsolete features in the second treatise. For instance, Locke feels he has to defend the notion not of a hypothetical but of an historical social contract. And Locke appeals to a natural moral law in a way which cannot easily be reconciled with his rejection in the first book of the essay of any innate ideas. But what matters are two quite different things. Locke insisted that the scope of government, however legitimate, should not be unlimited, and that the powers of government should be separated and balanced. For Rousseau, by contrast, the prime political problem is to ground state power in the general will. A power thus grounded, however absolute, however universally it intrudes, cannot be oppressive. For Marx, too, and above all for his Leninist successors, the problem is to ensure that those in power represent the interests of the favoured class. They have no thought at all of any need to circumscribe this power or to establish effective checks upon its holders. Since what some disclaim as Stalinism is in fact nothing but Marxist-Leninism in practice, it is no surprise to hear of the old Menshevik who devoted his last years in exile to learning lessons from Locke.
For he that thinks absolute power purifies men's bloods and corrects the baseness of human nature need but read the history of this or any other age to be convinced of the contrary.